I never thought I'd become invisible in my own son's house. My name is Helena, I'm 59 years old, and I'm about to tell you a story that might break your heart before it heals it. If you've ever felt like a burden to people you love, if you've ever been treated like furniture in your own family, then you'll understand every word I'm about to say. It started 3 months ago when I fell down my apartment stairs and shattered my hip in 2 places. The surgery went well, but the recovery, well, that's when I learned that being vulnerable changes how people see you. My son David called me from the hospital bed, his voice heavy with what I thought was concern. "Mom, you can't live alone anymore. Come stay with us until you're better." I should have heard the reluctance in his voice, but I was so grateful, so relieved. I thought I was going to spend my golden years surrounded by family, maybe help with grandchildren someday, share stories over dinner. I packed my few precious belongings, my late husband's watch, our wedding photos, my grandmother's recipe box, and moved into what I believed would be a temporary sanctuary. The first night, I hobbled to the kitchen on my walker and offered to help with dinner. Carla, my daughter-in-law, looked at me like I'd suggested burning the house down. "Helena," she said, not even bothering to hide her irritation, "just sit somewhere and try not to get in the way." I sat at their kitchen table, the same table where I used to hold David when he was a crying baby, where I taught him to tie his shoes, where I helped him with homework until midnight when he struggled in school. Now I was a guest in my own son's life, watching strangers live in the space where my presence used to matter. But I told myself it would get better. I told myself that Carla was just adjusting, that having an older woman in the house was probably stressful for her. I made excuses because that's what mothers do. We find ways to forgive the people we love, even when they don't deserve it. Every morning I woke up before dawn, determined to prove my worth. I would clean what I could reach, fold laundry with my arthritic fingers, water the little herb garden I'd started on their balcony. Small things, quiet things. I wanted to earn my place, to show them that I wasn't just taking up space, that I still had something to offer. But the silence grew thicker each day. David would come home from work, kiss Carla hello, and barely glance in my direction. "Hi, Mom," he'd mumble, already walking toward their bedroom. Dinner conversations happened around me, not with me. They discussed their friends, their work problems, their weekend plans, all as if I were a piece of furniture that happened to have ears. I started eating earlier, alone, just to avoid the discomfort of sitting at their table while they ignored me. I would prepare my small portion, eat in silence, and clean up before they even got home. It was easier than watching them live their lives while pretending I wasn't slowly dying inside theirs. The worst part wasn't the loneliness. I'd been a widow for 3 years, so loneliness was an old companion. The worst part was the way my own son looked through me, like I'd become a ghost of the mother who once sacrificed everything for him. The woman who worked double shifts to pay for his college, who drove him to every soccer practice, who held him when his first girlfriend broke his heart. She might as well have never existed. If you understand this feeling, if you've ever been made to feel like a burden by people who should love you, please subscribe to this channel. We're trying to reach 1,000 subscribers, and knowing that my story matters to someone out there means everything to me right now. And please, comment and tell me what city you're watching from. Sometimes it helps to know we're not alone in this world, because 3 months ago, I thought I was moving in with family. But tonight, as I write this in my small room, listening to them laugh in the living room about something I wasn't invited to share, I'm starting to understand that sometimes the people who should protect you are the ones who hurt you the most. And sometimes the silence in a full house is louder than any scream. The shift happened gradually, like watching a flower wilt in slow motion. At first, I convinced myself that David and Carla were just busy, that they needed time to adjust to having me in their space. But as weeks passed, their coldness became as routine as morning coffee, and far more bitter. Carla started leaving pointed reminders around the house. A note on the refrigerator about keeping common areas clean, even though I cleaned more than I messed. A passive-aggressive text about household contribution expectations, sent to David, but read aloud just within my hearing. Little paper cuts to the soul, each one small enough to seem petty if I complained, but sharp enough to draw blood from what was left of my dignity. The breaking point should have been obvious, But when you're desperate to belong somewhere, you ignore the warning signs that would be clear to anyone else. It was a Tuesday evening in late September. I had spent the entire afternoon preparing David's favorite meal, the beef stew my mother taught me to make, the same recipe I'd used to comfort him through childhood illnesses, teenage heartbreaks, and college stress. I'd gotten up at dawn despite the pain in my hip, walked 6 blocks to the market because I couldn't burden them by asking for a ride, and spent my own grocery money on the best ingredients I could afford. The beef was tender, the vegetables perfectly seasoned, the herbs fresh from the little garden I'd cultivated on their balcony with my own weathered hands. The kitchen filled with the rich aroma of home-cooked love, the kind of smell that used to make David run to the kitchen asking, "Is it ready yet, Mom?" I set the table carefully, even folded napkins the way I'd taught him for special occasions. I wanted this dinner to remind him of who we used to be together, of the bond that distance and time and his wife's coldness couldn't completely erase. When they came home, David's face lit up for just a moment, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him in weeks. "Is that your stew?" he asked, and for a heartbeat, I was his mother again instead of his burden. But Carla's expression darkened immediately. She looked at the table, at the carefully arranged meal, at me standing there with hope written all over my face, and something ugly twisted in her features. Without a word, she walked to the stove, picked up the entire pot of stew, hours of work, all my love ladled into that meal, and dumped it straight into the garbage. The sound of it hitting the trash will haunt me forever. Not just the waste of food, but the waste of hope, of effort, of the desperate attempt to matter in a house where I was increasingly unwelcome. "Old people don't deserve to eat first," she said, looking directly at me with something that went beyond dislike into active cruelty. "You're just here, like furniture, taking up space." I stood frozen, my hand still holding the serving spoon, watching 3 hours of careful preparation disappear into coffee grounds and banana peels. The kitchen suddenly felt enormous around me, like I was shrinking while the walls expanded, pushing me further into insignificance. But it was David's silence that broke something inside me. Not surprise, not shock at his wife's behavior. Just nothing. He looked at the garbage can, looked at me, looked at his wife, and said absolutely nothing. No defense of his mother, no rebuke for the woman who had just thrown away not just dinner, but every memory that recipe carried. In that moment, I understood that I wasn't just unwelcome. I was invisible. My son, the boy I had raised alone after his father died, the child I had protected and provided for through every hardship, was watching someone destroy his mother's dignity and choosing silence over love. Carla smirked at my stunned expression, clearly satisfied with the pain she'd caused. "I'll order pizza," she announced to David, as if I hadn't just been erased from their evening like chalk from a blackboard. Much better than whatever that was supposed to be. They sat on the couch eating their takeout, laughing at something on television, while I stood in the kitchen scraping my heart out of their garbage can, trying to clean up the mess that wasn't just beef and vegetables anymore, but the shattered pieces of a relationship I'd thought was unbreakable. That night, for the first time since moving in, I allowed myself to cry. Not the dignified tears of grief I'd shed for my husband, but the raw, ugly sobbing of someone who had finally understood that love isn't always enough, that being someone's mother doesn't guarantee being treated with basic human decency. But as I lay in that narrow guest room bed, something else began to grow alongside the hurt. It started as a tiny flame in the darkness, barely visible but undeniably warm. It wasn't anger exactly, though anger was certainly part of it. It was something deeper, something that had been sleeping for too long in the part of me that had learned to apologize for taking up space in the world. I reached for the notebook I kept beside my bed and began to write. Not a journal entry about my feelings, but facts. Times, dates, witnesses to the treatment I'd been enduring. Because somewhere in the fog of hurt, a clearer voice was beginning to whisper that this wasn't just about dinner anymore. This was about remembering who I used to be before grief and injury and loneliness made me small enough to fit into other people's corners. After the stew incident, I tried harder. I know that sounds pathetic, trying to earn love from people who had already shown me how little I meant to them, but hope dies hard in a mother's heart. I convinced myself that if I could just be more helpful, more invisible, More perfect? Maybe they would remember that I was still human. I started waking up at 5 in the morning, before my hip had a chance to stiffen completely, and I would clean their house from top to bottom. I scrubbed toilets with arthritic hands, vacuumed carpets while leaning on my walker, folded their laundry with the same care I'd once used to fold David's tiny baby clothes. I wanted to be indispensable, thinking that usefulness might earn me the basic kindness that love had failed to provide. But the more I did, the more entitled they became to my invisible labor. Carla would leave dishes in the sink for days, knowing I'd eventually wash them because I couldn't stand the smell. She'd track mud through the house in her expensive boots, then comment loudly to David about how some people don't know how to keep a house properly clean. Every mess became my fault, every imperfection a reflection of my inadequacy. The worst part was how they talked about me when they thought I couldn't hear. Their bedroom was next to the guest room where I slept, and the walls were thinner than their compassion. I'd lie in bed, my hip aching from the day's work, listening to them discuss me like I was a problem to be solved rather than a person to be loved. "She's getting worse," Carla would whisper, her voice carrying easily through the drywall. "More clingy, more pathetic. Did you see how she hovered around the kitchen today? Like a lost puppy." "She's trying to help," David would respond weakly, but even his defense sounded tired, obligatory. "She's trying to guilt us into feeling sorry for her. It's manipulative, David. My mother would never put this kind of emotional burden on me." Emotional burden. That's what I had become to my only child. The woman who had carried him in her body, who had given up dreams and opportunities and sometimes meals to make sure he had everything he needed. I was now an emotional burden because I dared to exist in the same space as his happiness. They started having friends over more often, and those evenings were exercises in social humiliation. I would retreat to my room when company arrived, not because they asked me to, but because their discomfort with my presence was so palpable it made everyone else uncomfortable too. But sometimes I couldn't avoid encountering their guests, when I needed water, or when I had to use the bathroom. "Oh, this is David's mother," Carla would say when forced to acknowledge me, her tone suggesting she was introducing an unfortunate family obligation rather than a human being. "She's staying with us for a while." The pause before staying with us always lasted just long enough for everyone to understand that my presence was temporary and unwelcome. Their friends would smile politely, the way people do when they encounter someone else's awkward situation, then quickly change the subject back to topics that didn't include old women with walkers and broken hips. I became an expert at reading the social cues that told me when to disappear. The slight tightening around David's eyes when I entered a room. The way Carla's voice would get artificially bright when she had to speak to me in front of others. The uncomfortable silence that would fall when I tried to contribute to conversations about anything more substantial than the weather. But the moment that finally cracked my heart completely came during David's birthday dinner in October. I had saved for weeks from my small Social Security check to buy him a gift. A photo album I'd filled with pictures from his childhood, each one accompanied by a handwritten note about the memory it captured. His first steps, his graduation day, the proud smile on his face when he got his first job. I'd spent hours writing those memories, pouring love onto pages the way other people pour wine. When I gave it to him, his face went through a series of expressions I'd never seen before. First surprise, then something that might have been genuine emotion, then embarrassment. He flipped through a few pages while Carla watched with barely concealed irritation, and I could see him calculating how to react in a way that wouldn't upset his wife, while not completely destroying his mother. "Thanks, Mom," he said finally, closing the album without looking at the rest. "This is really thoughtful." But he set it aside immediately, and I watched him open Carla's gift instead, an expensive watch that probably cost more than I'd spent on food in the past month. His reaction was everything mine wasn't. Genuine excitement, gratitude, a kiss for his wife that lasted long enough to make me feel like I was intruding on an intimate moment. Later that evening, I saw the photo album in their bedroom, placed on a shelf where it would be forgotten among Carla's romance novels and David's work manuals. 43 years of memories, hours of careful work, all the love I could pour onto paper, relegated to storage like everything else from our shared past. That night, I added another entry to my notebook, not just about the gift, but about the pattern I was finally beginning to see clearly. This wasn't about adjustment periods or stress or needing time to work things out. This was about two people who had decided that my value as a human being was less important than their comfort, and my presence in their lives was a burden they were learning to resent, rather than a blessing they had once treasured. I sat in that narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, and for the first time since moving in, I allowed myself to think the thought I'd been pushing away for months. Maybe the problem isn't that I'm not trying hard enough to fit into their lives. Maybe the problem is that I'm trying to fit into a space where I was never really welcome in the first place. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop shrinking myself small enough to fit into other people's ideas of where I belonged. By November, I had stopped trying. Not because I wanted to, but because my soul had finally understood what my mind had been refusing to accept, that some battles can't be won with love, and some people will see kindness as weakness no matter how purely it's offered. The house became a theater where I performed the role of the invisible woman. I moved through rooms like a ghost, completing my tasks without expecting acknowledgement, eating my meals in silence without hoping for conversation, existing in the margins of a life that had once revolved around my love for my son. The breaking point wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, mundane, almost forgettable, which made it somehow worse. I was sitting at the kitchen table on a gray Thursday morning, slowly eating a piece of toast because my medication made me nauseous if I took it on an empty stomach. David was getting ready for work, rushing around looking for his keys, his phone, his sense of purpose. "Mom," he said without looking at me, "can you make sure the house is clean today? Carla's having her book club over this afternoon." I nodded, as I always did, because what else was there to do? But then he paused at the door, keys in hand, and added the words that finally broke what was left of my spirit. "And maybe, could you just stay in your room while they're here? It's easier for everyone that way. Easier for everyone. Not embarrassing for him, not uncomfortable for his wife, not awkward for their guests. Just easier." As if my presence was a complication that needed to be managed rather than a relationship that deserved respect. He left without waiting for an answer, without seeing how those words landed on me like stones thrown at glass. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time after his car disappeared down the street, staring at my half-eaten toast and wondering when exactly I had become someone my own child was ashamed to acknowledge. That afternoon, I cleaned their house with mechanical precision. I dusted furniture that would probably be dusty again by evening, vacuumed carpets that showed no signs of wear because I was the only one walking on them most days, scrubbed bathrooms that were already spotless because I had cleaned them the day before. Then I retreated to my room like a prisoner returning to her cell, listening through the thin walls as 8 women laughed and discussed their books and their lives and their children who loved them. I heard Carla telling them about her latest vacation plans, her voice bright with the kind of joy I hadn't heard directed at me in months. Someone asked about David's new promotion at work, news that was apparently worth sharing with book club members, but not with his mother. They talked about their families, their grandchildren, their retirement dreams, all while I sat 10 feet away, erased from the narrative of my son's life. When they left 3 hours later, I emerged to find the living room destroyed. Coffee cups on every surface, crumbs ground into the carpet. Someone had spilled red wine on the white couch I had helped David pick out when he first moved into this house. The mess was extensive enough that cleaning it would take me the rest of the evening. But what hurt more was finding the photo album I'd given David for his birthday, shoved carelessly under a stack of coasters, as if someone had needed to move it out of the way and couldn't be bothered to treat it with any care. I held that album in my arthritic hands and felt something inside me finally surrender. Not just my hope that things would get better, but my belief that I deserved better. Somewhere in the months of being treated like furniture, I had started to believe that maybe they were right. Maybe I was a burden. Maybe my love was too much, my needs too inconvenient, my presence too painful a reminder of obligations they wished they could forget. That night, I stopped writing in my notebook. What was the point of documenting humiliation when no one would ever read it? What was the point of recording pain when the only audience was myself? I put the notebook in the drawer next to my bed and closed it like closing the door on a room I'd never enter again. I started eating 1 meal a day, not because I couldn't afford more, but because hunger felt appropriate somehow, like penance for the crime of existing in spaces where I wasn't wanted. I stopped tending my little herb garden on the balcony, watching the plants wither from neglect the same way I was withering from emotional starvation. Sleep became my only escape, but even that was contaminated by dreams where David was young again, where he ran to me with skinned knees and broken hearts, where I was still the person he turned to when the world hurt him. I would wake from those dreams to find myself in the narrow guest room bed, my hip aching, my heart empty, my purpose vanished like morning mist. December arrived with the kind of cold that seeps into old bones and stays there. I developed a cough that I didn't bother to mention because who would care anyway? I moved more slowly, spoke even less, became so transparent that sometimes I wondered if I was actually disappearing, fading away like old photographs left too long in sunlight. But on December 15th, exactly 6 months after my fall, something happened that changed everything. I was sitting in my room, staring out the window at the bare trees and gray sky, when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I hadn't seen in years. Margaret Chen, my late husband's cousin. I almost didn't answer. What was the point of conversation when you had nothing left to say about your life? But something made me pick up that phone. Maybe just the desperate need to hear another human voice speak my name with something other than obligation or irritation. Helena? Margaret's voice was warm, concerned. I've been thinking about you. How are you managing since the accident? Are you getting the support you need? And for the first time in months, someone was asking about me, not as a problem to be solved, but as a person whose well-being mattered. I started to give her the standard answer. I'm fine. Everything's fine. Don't worry about me. But something in her tone made me stop. Instead, I told her the truth. All of it. The cold silences, the destroyed dinner, the birthday gift gathering dust, the instruction to hide in my room like a shameful secret. And as I spoke, I heard my own voice getting stronger, not with anger, but with clarity. Margaret listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said something that rekindled a spark I thought had died forever. Helena, you know that house you're living in? The one where they're treating you like this? Whose name is actually on the deed? I blinked, confused. I don't understand what you mean. Think, honey. When Robert died, what happened to the house you two shared? Did you sell it? Or did you transfer ownership to David when you moved in with them? And suddenly, like sunlight breaking through clouds, I remembered something I had completely forgotten in my fog of grief and injury and desperate gratitude. Something that changed everything, but I still had something they had forgotten. Something that would change everything. After Margaret's call, I sat in that narrow guest room for 3 hours, staring at the wall and feeling something shift inside me like tectonic plates moving beneath the Earth's surface. The house I was living in, the house where I was being treated like unwanted furniture, was still legally mine. In my grief after Robert's death and the chaos following my accident, I had completely forgotten this crucial fact. When David had called from the hospital suggesting I move in with them, I had been so grateful, so desperate not to be alone, that I never questioned the logistics. I assumed he meant I would be moving in as his dependent, his burden to bear. It never occurred to me that he was actually moving into my house, the house Robert and I had bought 37 years ago, the house where I had raised David, where every room held memories of a life built with love and sacrifice. Margaret's voice echoed in my mind. Whose name is actually on the deed? Mine. Helena Morrison. Not David's, not Carla's. Mine. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I lay in the darkness, my mind moving through memories with new clarity. Robert and I purchasing this house when David was just 2 years old, both of us working double shifts to afford the down payment. The mortgage payments I had continued making alone after Robert's death, using my careful budgeting and his life insurance to ensure our son would always have a secure home to return to. The pride I'd felt when the final payment was made 5 years ago, the satisfaction of owning something outright in a world where so little felt permanent or secure. I had never transferred the deed to David. The thought had never even occurred to me. Why would I sign away the only security I had? The only thing that belonged fully and completely to me? But grief does strange things to memory, and the combination of losing Robert, Breaking my hip and being systematically devalued by my son and his wife had somehow made me forget the most important fact of my current situation. I wasn't living in their house as their dependent. They were living in my house as my— what exactly? Guests? Tenants? People who had somehow convinced me to give up my own bedroom and sleep in the guest room of my own home? The next morning, I waited until they left for work, then retrieved the metal box from the back of my closet where I kept important documents. My hands shook as I opened it, searching through birth certificates, insurance papers, and Robert's death certificate, until I found what I was looking for: the deed to the house, clearly showing Helena Morrison as the sole owner. There it was, in black and white legal language that couldn't be argued with or dismissed. This house, every room where I had been made to feel unwelcome, every kitchen where my cooking had been rejected, every living space where I had been told to hide from visitors, all of it belonged to me. I sat on the floor of my closet, holding that piece of paper, and felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Power. Not the angry, vindictive kind of power that seeks to hurt others, but the quiet, steady power of someone who finally remembers who she really is. But I didn't act immediately. That would have been the old Helena, the one who rushed to fix problems and smooth over conflicts before they could escalate. This new understanding required careful thought, strategic planning. I had spent months learning to observe rather than react, and now that skill would serve me well. I began to watch David and Carla with different eyes. Instead of seeing them as the people I needed to please, I started seeing them as they really were. Two adults who had moved into my house, taken over my space, and convinced me that I should be grateful for the privilege of existing in my own home. The more I observed, the clearer the situation became. David had his home office set up in what used to be Robert's study, surrounded by his law books and expensive electronics. Carla had transformed the master bedroom, my bedroom, into her personal sanctuary, complete with her clothes filling the walk-in closet and her toiletries crowding the bathroom counter. They had made themselves at home in every sense of the phrase, while making me feel homeless in the process. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had underestimated me so completely that they never bothered to check the legal details of the arrangement. They assumed that a broken-down old woman with a walker and a wounded heart posed no threat to their comfortable setup. I retrieved my notebook from the drawer where I had abandoned it and began writing again. But this time, I wasn't documenting my pain for its own sake. I was building a case, creating a record, preparing for action. Every slight, every cruel comment, every moment when I had been treated as less than human in my own home, all of it went into that notebook with dates, times, and witnesses where applicable. Margaret called me again 3 days later. "I've been thinking about our conversation," she said. "Have you looked into the legal aspects of your situation?" "I found the deed," I told her quietly. "The house is still mine." "I thought it might be." "Helena, you need to understand something. What they're doing to you isn't just morally wrong, it's potentially illegal. Elder abuse takes many forms, and emotional abuse is just as serious as physical abuse. You have rights, legal rights, that are being violated." Margaret had retired from her position as a family court judge, but she still had connections in the legal community. More importantly, she understood how the law worked and how it could protect people like me. "What would you do if you were me?" I asked. And for the first time in months, I wasn't asking the question from a position of helplessness. "I would reclaim my house," she said simply. "I would remember that ownership comes with rights, and I would exercise those rights. But Helena, you need to be prepared for the fact that this won't be easy. They've gotten comfortable treating you this way. They're not going to like being reminded that they don't hold all the cards." That evening, I made a decision. I took my notebook and my deed, and I walked to the kitchen where David and Carla were eating dinner at the table I had bought 30 years ago. They looked up at me with the usual mixture of irritation and impatience, clearly annoyed that their conversation about vacation plans was being interrupted by my presence. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady in a way it hadn't been for months. Carla rolled her eyes. "Can't it wait? We're eating." "No," I said, and something in my tone made them both look at me more carefully. "It can't wait." I placed the deed on the table between their dinner plates, the legal document landing with the weight of truth finally spoken aloud. "This is my house. I said, meeting each of their eyes in turn. And we're going to discuss new arrangements for how things work here. The silence that followed wasn't the uncomfortable quiet I had grown accustomed to. This was different. This was the silence that comes when the balance of power shifts so suddenly that everyone needs a moment to understand the new reality. David picked up the deed, his face going pale as he read his own address with his mother's name listed as the sole owner. Carla's expression moved through confusion, recognition, and finally landed on something that looked very much like fear. "Mom?" David began, but I held up my hand to stop him. "Not anymore," I said. It wasn't pain I was feeling now. It was decision. The silence stretched between us like a bridge I had finally decided to cross. David stared at the deed in his hands as if it were written in a foreign language, while Carla's face cycled through emotions like a weather system in fast forward. Confusion giving way to understanding, understanding blooming into indignation, and indignation crystallizing into the kind of cold fury I had been living with for months. "This doesn't change anything," she said finally, her voice carrying the brittle edge of someone who had just realized their comfortable world was built on foundations they didn't control. "You can't just kick us out. We have rights. We've been taking care of you. Taking care of me." The words would have been laughable if they weren't so revealing of how completely she had rewritten our reality in her own mind. In Carla's version of events, she was the generous daughter-in-law who had opened her home to a needy elder, rather than the woman who had moved into my house and convinced me I should be grateful for scraps of basic human decency. "Rights," I repeated, testing the word on my tongue like I was learning a new language. "Yes, let's talk about rights." I sat down at my kitchen table, and for the first time in months, I thought of it as my table rather than the place where I was barely tolerated, and opened my notebook. The pages rustled as I flipped through months of careful documentation, each entry a small wound that I had learned to treat as evidence rather than just pain. "October 15th, I began, reading from my careful handwriting. "Carla threw my dinner in the garbage and told me old people don't deserve to eat first." David said nothing. I looked up at my son, whose face had gone white. "November 3rd. David asked me to hide in my room during his birthday party because my presence would make everyone uncomfortable. November 22nd. Carla told her book club that I was just staying temporarily and, unfortunately, had nowhere else to go." With each entry I read, the air in the room seemed to grow thicker, heavier with the weight of documented cruelty. These weren't just isolated incidents that could be explained away or minimized. They were a pattern, a systematic campaign of emotional abuse that had been so constant, I had almost stopped noticing it. David finally found his voice. "Mom, I didn't realize—" "You didn't realize what?" I asked, my voice gentle but firm. "That I'm a human being who deserves basic respect? That I'm your mother, not a burden you're stuck with? Or did you not realize that I still own this house and everything in it?" Carla stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor with a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard. "This is ridiculous. You're being dramatic. So what if you own the house? You can't take care of it yourself. You need us here." "Do I?" I asked, and I could hear in my own voice the quiet strength that had been buried under months of gaslighting and deliberate diminishment. "Or do you need me to believe that I need you?" I closed the notebook and placed it carefully beside the deed. 2 pieces of paper that told the complete story. One showing my legal rights, the other documenting how those rights had been trampled by people who should have been protecting them. "Here's what's going to happen," I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. "You have 30 days to find new living arrangements. I'm reclaiming my house, my bedroom, my kitchen, and my life. If you choose to stay, it will be as tenants paying fair market rent, with a signed lease that includes clauses about mutual respect and shared household responsibilities." "You can't be serious," Carla said, but her voice had lost its earlier confidence. "Where are we supposed to go in 30 days? "I don't know," I replied, and I felt no guilt in that admission. "But I'm sure you'll figure something out. You're both adults with jobs and presumably some savings. I had less than that when I was your age, and I managed to buy this house and raise a child in it." David was staring at me as if seeing me for the first time in years. "Mom, can we talk about this? Maybe there's a compromise we can reach." A compromise. I tasted the word, and it was bitter on my tongue. David, for months I've been compromising. I compromised my dignity by accepting treatment that no human being should tolerate. I compromised my own comfort by sleeping in the guest room of my own house. I compromised my right to basic respect by pretending it was normal for your wife to throw my cooking in the garbage and tell me I didn't deserve to eat. I stood up, my walker clicking against the floor, but I felt stronger than I had in months. The time for compromise was when you first moved in here and we established ground rules based on mutual respect. That didn't happen. Instead, you both decided that my gratitude for your presence should be payment enough for being treated like unwanted furniture in my own home. Carla's mask finally slipped completely. Fine, she snapped. We'll leave. But don't expect us to come running back when you fall again and need help. Don't expect us to take care of you when you're too old and sick to manage on your own. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had finally burned down to manageable embers. For months, this exact fear had kept me silent, compliant, grateful for crumbs. The terror of being abandoned, of having no one, of facing the inevitable vulnerabilities of aging completely alone. But something had shifted in me during these past weeks of remembering who I really was. Carla, I said, my voice carrying a kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. If this is how you take care of people you claim to love, then being alone would be a blessing by comparison. The truth of that statement hit me like a physical sensation, warm and liberating. I had been so afraid of being alone that I had accepted being lonely while surrounded by people who treated me with contempt. I had been so terrified of abandonment that I had allowed myself to be emotionally abandoned while physically present in my own home. David tried one more time. Mom, maybe we got off track, but we can fix this. We're family. Yes, I agreed. We are family. And families are supposed to protect each other, not prey on each other. Families are supposed to lift each other up, not systematically tear each other down until the weakest member feels grateful just to be allowed to exist in the same space. I walked to the window that looked out onto the backyard where I used to have a garden. Before my hip injury, before I became convinced that I didn't deserve to take up space with my interests and hobbies. The yard was overgrown now, neglected like so many other parts of my life that I had abandoned in my desperate attempt to make myself small enough to be acceptable. Tomorrow, I'm calling Margaret Chen, I announced, turning back to face them. She's going to recommend a lawyer who specializes in elder rights and real estate law. I want everything documented properly. I want a legal notice prepared, a timeline established, and witnesses to any future conversations we have about living arrangements. You're really doing this, David said, and I couldn't tell if his tone was accusatory or admiring. I'm really doing this, I confirmed. For the first time in months, I'm making decisions based on what I deserve rather than what I'm afraid of losing. That night, after they had retreated to their bedroom, my bedroom, for whispered arguments that I could hear through the thin walls but no longer cared to decipher, I sat in the living room with a cup of tea and my husband's old photo albums. I had avoided looking at these pictures since moving into the guest room, unable to bear the reminder of how happy I had once been in this house. But now I flipped through pages of memories with new eyes. Here was Robert painting the kitchen yellow because I said it would make the room feel more cheerful. Here was young David helping me plant tomatoes in the backyard, his small hands dirty with soil, and his face bright with pride at being trusted with real responsibility. Here was Christmas morning 15 years ago, the tree surrounded by presents and the whole house glowing with the warmth that comes from people who genuinely enjoy each other's company. This house had been filled with love once. It could be again, even if that love looked different now, even if it was quieter and more solitary than the family chaos I had once treasured. As I closed the photo album and prepared for bed, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before my accident: anticipation for tomorrow. Not anxiety about what might go wrong, but genuine curiosity about what I might build once I stopped using all my energy to make myself acceptable to people who had never intended to accept me anyway. For the first time in months, I was planning instead of just surviving. And that planning felt like the first real breath I had taken in a very long time. Margaret arrived at my house on a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after my confrontation with David and Carla. carrying a leather briefcase and the kind of quiet authority that comes from decades of making decisions that change people's lives. She had brought with her James Patterson, a lawyer who specialized in elder law and property rights, a man in his 60s with kind eyes and the patient manner of someone who had spent his career protecting vulnerable people from those who would exploit them. The week between my ultimatum and this meeting had been tense but revealing. David and Carla had tried every manipulation tactic in their arsenal, cycling through denial, anger, bargaining, and what they probably thought was charm. They had oscillated between treating me like a confused elderly woman who didn't understand the complexity of the situation and acknowledging me as a property owner whose decisions they needed to respect. Carla had attempted tears, claiming that all she had ever wanted was to help me, that she was hurt and confused by my sudden hostility toward people who had sacrificed so much to care for me. When tears failed to move me, she had tried anger, accusing me of being ungrateful, manipulative, and cruel to people who had opened their home to me in my time of need. David had vacillated between guilt trips about family loyalty and practical arguments about the financial benefits of our current arrangement. "Mom, think about this reasonably," he had said just the night before. "We help with utilities, we maintain the house, we're here if you have another accident. Isn't that worth something?" But I had spent too many months listening to these same arguments used to justify treating me like an unwelcome guest in my own home. I had learned the difference between genuine care and self-serving convenience, between family obligation and family love. "Mrs. Morrison," James Patterson said as he settled into my living room chair, the chair I had chosen and paid for 30 years ago. "I've reviewed the documentation you provided to Margaret, and I want you to understand that you have multiple legal options available. But before we discuss those options, I need to ask, are you certain this is the path you want to pursue? Family disputes involving property can become very complicated, very quickly. I looked at this kind man who was trying to protect me from additional heartache, and I appreciated his caution. But I had moved beyond the point where avoiding conflict was more important than reclaiming my dignity. "Mr. Patterson," I replied, "for months, I have been living as a refugee in my own home. I have been made to feel grateful for basic human decency, apologetic for taking up space, and invisible in conversations about my own future. If this is what family looks like, then I need legal protection from my family." Margaret nodded approvingly. "Helena has documented months of emotional abuse, financial exploitation, and what I would characterize as elder intimidation. The fact that she owns the property where this is occurring gives her significant legal leverage to change the situation." James opened his briefcase and withdrew several documents. "I've prepared a formal 30-day notice to vacate, which is legally required even when family members are involved. I've also drafted a proposed rental agreement, should they choose to stay under formalized terms that protect your rights as both property owner and resident." He spread the papers across my coffee table, and I felt a surge of something I hadn't experienced in months, the satisfaction of being taken seriously by people who understood that I had both rights and the intelligence to exercise them. "The notice to vacate is straightforward," James continued. "It establishes a clear timeline and legal framework for their departure. The rental agreement includes clauses about mutual respect, shared household responsibilities, and financial obligations. It also includes specific language about elder abuse and the immediate termination of any lease agreement if emotional or financial abuse occurs." David and Carla chose that moment to enter the house, returning from errands with the casual assumption that they could walk into their living room without encountering legal professionals discussing their immediate future. The sight of official documents spread across the coffee table stopped them both in the doorway. "What's going on here?" Carla demanded, her voice carrying the sharp edge of someone who had just realized that a situation she thought she controlled was spinning beyond her influence. "These are Margaret Chen and James Patterson," I said calmly. "Margaret is a retired family court judge, and James is an attorney who specializes in elder law and property rights. We're discussing my legal options regarding this house and your continued residency here." David's face went pale. As someone who worked in the legal field himself, he understood immediately that this wasn't an empty threat or an emotional outburst from a confused elderly woman. This was serious legal action being taken by someone who had professional representation and documented evidence of mistreatment. "Mom, Surely we can work this out without bringing lawyers into it, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. He could see the papers on the table, could read enough of the legal language to understand that formal notice had already been prepared. David, Margaret said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades mediating family disputes. Your mother tried to work things out for months. She tried to communicate her needs, tried to find compromises, tried to maintain family relationships while being systematically devalued and emotionally abused in her own home. The time for informal resolution passed when you and your wife decided that her ownership of this property was less important than your comfort. Carla's composure finally cracked completely. This is insane. We've been taking care of her. We moved in here to help her after her accident, and now she's trying to throw us out on the street because we hurt her precious feelings? The contempt in her voice, the dismissive way she characterized months of documented emotional abuse as hurt feelings, crystallized everything I had been trying to articulate about why this situation had become unbearable. Carla, I said, my voice steady but carrying steel underneath the softness. You threw my dinner in the garbage and told me old people don't deserve to eat first. You instructed me to hide in my room when you had company so I wouldn't embarrass you. You've spent months treating me like unwanted furniture in my own home. And now you're surprised that I'm no longer willing to accept that treatment. James looked up from his papers. Mrs. Morrison has documented extensive emotional abuse, which under state law constitutes elder abuse regardless of familial relationships. She has been financially supporting a household where she was denied basic dignity and respect. Her decision to reclaim her property rights is not only legally sound, but personally necessary for her well-being. The room fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock that Robert and I had bought for our 10th wedding anniversary. A sound that had marked the passing of time through decades of genuine happiness in this house. David tried one last appeal. Mom, I know we haven't been perfect, but we're family. We can change. We can do better. I looked at my son, this man I had raised from infancy, whose scraped knees I had bandaged and whose broken hearts I had mended, and I felt a profound sadness for the person he had become. But sadness was no longer enough to make me accept unacceptable treatment. David, I said gently, change is something you do before you lose someone's trust, not after you've already destroyed it. For months, you watched your wife treat me with cruelty, and you chose her comfort over my basic dignity. That choice has consequences. Margaret stood up and handed David the formal notice to vacate. You have 30 days to find alternative housing. If you choose to contest this notice, you have legal rights to do so. But I should warn you that challenging an elderly property owner's decision to reclaim her own home, especially when there's documented evidence of mistreatment, is unlikely to succeed and will certainly become public record. Carla snatched the papers from David's hands, her face flushed with anger, and what I recognized as the panic of someone who had just realized that actions have consequences. Fine, she said, her voice shaking with rage. We'll leave, but don't expect us to come back when you need help. Don't expect us to take care of you when you're old and sick and have no one. I'm already old, I replied calmly, and I've been sick. And for the past several months, I've discovered what it feels like to have no one despite being surrounded by family. If this is what your version of care looks like, then I'm better off alone. The truth of that statement rang through the room like a bell, clear and undeniable. I had been more lonely living with them than I had ever been living by myself, more afraid under their roof than I had ever been facing the world on my own. As they stormed out of the room, muttering about ungrateful mothers and legal harassment, I felt something settle into place inside my chest. Not happiness exactly, but something deeper and more sustainable. The quiet satisfaction of someone who had finally stopped shrinking herself to fit into spaces where she was never truly welcome. Margaret reached over and squeezed my hand. You did the right thing, Helena. It was hard, but it was right. And for the first time in months, I believed that someone else's assessment of my choices actually mattered, because it was coming from someone who had seen me as worthy of respect before I had remembered that I deserved it. 3 months later, I am writing this final chapter from my kitchen table, my table, in my house, where I eat my meals without fear of judgment and cook my recipes without worrying that someone will throw my efforts into the garbage. The morning sun streams through windows I had forgotten were so bright, illuminating a space that feels like home again for the first time in almost a year. David and Carla moved out exactly 29 days after receiving their legal notice. They took only what belonged to them, leaving behind the furniture they had assumed was theirs by right of occupation. The house felt cavernously empty for the first week after their departure, but it was the good kind of empty, the silence of possibility, rather than the silence of suppression. The master bedroom is mine again, filled with furniture that Robert and I chose together, decorated with photographs that tell the story of a life lived fully, rather than a life spent apologizing for existing. I sleep in my own bed, use my own bathroom, and wake up each morning with the revolutionary realization that no one is going to make me feel unwelcome in my own space. My herb garden has been replanted and expanded. What started as a few pots on the balcony has grown into raised beds throughout the backyard, tended by these arthritic hands that have learned they still have work to do in this world. I grow basil and oregano, thyme and rosemary, cilantro and parsley, enough to season my own meals and share with neighbors who have become friends, now that I'm no longer too ashamed of my circumstances to maintain relationships. Margaret visits every Tuesday for coffee and conversation that ranges from books we're reading to memories of our late spouses, to plans for home improvement projects I had abandoned when I convinced myself I didn't deserve to invest in my own comfort. Her friendship has been a reminder that meaningful relationships can exist between people who treat each other with mutual respect and genuine affection. James Patterson helped me establish a small emergency fund and connect with resources for aging in place, modifications to make the house safer and more accessible, services that can provide support when I need it without requiring me to surrender my autonomy or dignity. Most importantly, he helped me understand that accepting help and being controlled are not the same thing, that needing assistance doesn't mean accepting abuse. I've heard from David twice since he moved out. The first time was 3 days after their departure, when he called to ask if I had come to my senses and was ready to discuss reconciliation. The second call came 6 weeks later, when he informed me that Carla was pregnant and that I was going to be a grandmother whether I liked it or not. Both conversations were brief. I wished him well and told him that my door would be open when he was ready to have a relationship based on mutual respect, rather than emotional manipulation. The hardest part of these months hasn't been the loneliness. I had been lonely while living with them, so solitude feels like peace by comparison. The hardest part has been untangling the ways I had internalized their treatment of me, the voice in my head that still sometimes whispers that maybe I was too demanding, maybe I should have been more grateful, maybe I destroyed my family over hurt feelings rather than legitimate grievances. But then I remember the notebook, now stored safely in my desk drawer, filled with months of documented cruelty. I remember the feeling of being told to hide in my room like a shameful secret. I remember watching my carefully prepared dinner disappear into the garbage while being told that old people don't deserve to eat first. And I remember that love, real love, the kind worth having, doesn't require someone to make themselves smaller, quieter, less than they are in order to be acceptable. The most unexpected gift of this experience has been discovering that I like my own company. For decades, my identity was built around caring for others. First Robert, then David, then desperately trying to earn acceptance from David and Carla. Living alone has taught me that Helena Morrison, separate from her roles as wife and mother, is someone worth knowing, someone deserving of comfort and respect, and the simple pleasure of making decisions based on what she wants rather than what others will tolerate. I've started taking art classes at the senior center, something I had always wanted to do but convinced myself was too frivolous, too self-indulgent. My paintings aren't masterpieces, but they're mine. Expressions of colors and shapes and emotions that don't have to please anyone but me. The teacher, a woman named Rosa, who reminds me that learning doesn't stop just because your hair goes gray, says I have natural instincts for color and composition. Last week, I received a card from a woman named Patricia, whose story Margaret had shared with me. Another mother who had been emotionally abused by adult children who moved into her house and convinced her she should be grateful for their presence. Patricia had read about my situation through Margaret's network of retired legal professionals, and she wanted to thank me for showing her that it was possible to reclaim your life, even when it felt too late to start over. Reading about your courage gave me the strength to have the conversation I'd been avoiding for 2 years. She wrote in careful handwriting that reminded me of my own. My daughter and her husband moved out last month, and for the first time since they arrived, I can breathe in my own house. Thank you for proving that it's never too late to remember who you are. Her letter sits on my refrigerator now, held in place by a magnet shaped like a sunflower, a reminder that sometimes our most difficult experiences become gifts we can offer to others who are fighting the same battles. David called last night, his voice different somehow, smaller, less certain than the confident tone he had used when he lived here. "Mom," he said, "I've been thinking about everything that happened. I know I wasn't the son you deserved. And Carla, we both made mistakes." It wasn't a full apology, not yet, but it was acknowledgement, which felt like the beginning of something that might eventually grow into genuine reconciliation. "David," I told him, "I love you. I have always loved you. But love without respect isn't enough to build a relationship on. When you're ready to treat me like a person whose feelings matter as much as your convenience, my door is open." This morning, as I write these final words, I'm preparing to host my first dinner party in over a year. Margaret is coming, along with Rosa from my art class, Patricia, whose letter touched my heart, and 2 neighbors who have become genuine friends since I stopped being too ashamed of my life to cultivate relationships. I'm making the beef stew that Carla threw away all those months ago, the recipe my mother taught me, and that I taught David during happier times when cooking for people was an expression of love rather than desperate hope for acceptance. The difference is that tonight, my guests are coming because they want to share a meal with Helena Morrison, not because they're obligated to tolerate her presence in exchange for something they want. The table is set with my good china, not because the occasion is formally special, but because I have learned that treating yourself with dignity doesn't require anyone else's permission. The flowers from my garden sit in the center of the table, bright yellow marigolds that I planted not because anyone asked me to, but because I like the way they look in the morning sun. As I stir the pot and taste the seasoning, adjusting the herbs the way my mother taught me 60 years ago, I think about all the women who might be reading this story. Maybe you're sitting in a guest room of your own house, convinced that you should be grateful for treatment that makes you feel invisible. Maybe you're walking on eggshells around family members who have convinced you that your needs are unreasonable, your feelings too much, your presence a burden they're generously willing to bear. If that's you, I want you to understand something that took me almost 60 years to learn. You are not too much. Your feelings are not an inconvenience. Your needs are not unreasonable. The people who love you, really love you, will not ask you to make yourself smaller in order to fit into their lives. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to show them that their behavior has consequences. Sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is stop accepting unacceptable treatment, even when the alternative looks scary and uncertain. I learned that silence can be its own form of communication, that withdrawing your presence from people who don't value it is not cruelty, but self-preservation. I learned that sometimes the people who should protect you are the ones you need protection from, and that protecting yourself is not selfish but necessary. Most importantly, I learned that it's never too late to remember who you are. It's never too late to reclaim your space, your voice, your right to exist in the world without apology. It's never too late to choose dignity over desperation, solitude over humiliation, the uncertain adventure of self-respect over the familiar pain of being diminished by people who claim to care about you. Tonight, as I serve dinner to people who genuinely want to be here, who see my hospitality as a gift rather than an obligation, I'll raise my glass to all the women who are still finding their courage, to all the mothers who are learning that love doesn't require them to accept abuse, to all the grandmothers who are discovering that their stories aren't over just because other people have decided they're inconvenient. The house is filled with the aroma of home-cooked food and the anticipation of genuine conversation. The table is set for people who will treat each other with kindness and respect. The woman cooking this meal, me, is no longer apologizing for taking up space in the world. And in this kitchen, where I was once made to feel unwelcome, where my offerings were literally thrown away as worthless, I have learned the most important lesson of my life. Sometimes the greatest act of love you can offer the world is refusing to accept anything less than love in return. In this house, elders are honored, and if they can't be honored, then those who dishonor them must leave. I rebuilt my life with the same hands that once served others who didn't deserve my service. Now those hands serve people who understand that what I'm offering is precious, not because I'm desperate for their acceptance, but because I have learned to value what I bring to the table. And in the silence that follows truth finally spoken, I have found not emptiness, but peace.